There is a private kind of grief that rarely looks like failure. It happens when a person pauses long enough to notice that the life they are living does not quite belong to the person they once imagined becoming. Nothing may be visibly broken. They may still be functioning, still answering messages, still moving through ordinary days. But somewhere beneath the routine, a quiet fracture has already formed. And what unsettles them most is not that they have fallen behind. It is the stranger realization that they have slowly drifted away from themselves, not in one dramatic collapse, not in one catastrophic mistake, but through small compromises, repeated avoidance, familiar fears dressed up as practicality, 1,000 invisible moments in which they abandoned something essential without even noticing. That is the unnerving part, because the deepest crises do not always announce themselves as chaos. Sometimes they arrive as recognition. Sometimes they arrive as the unbearable thought that the person in the mirror is not false exactly, but unfinished, conditioned, adapted, reduced. And once that thought appears, it becomes difficult to go back to sleep inside your old identity. That moment of recognition is where transformation truly begins, not when life becomes inspirational, not when motivation peaks, not when someone decides to reinvent themselves in a burst of temporary intensity. Real transformation begins earlier than that, and deeper. It begins in the unsettling space where awareness becomes too sharp to ignore, but clarity has not yet arrived. People often imagine change as a decision, a breakthrough, a clean turning point. But psychologically, change is rarely clean. It is more like an internal reorganization, a slow dismantling of perceptions, defenses, habits of thought, emotional reflexes, and inherited beliefs. It is not merely the act of doing better things. It is the far more difficult process of seeing from a different center of self. That is why deep change often feels disorienting before it feels liberating. Before anything meaningful changes on the outside, something inside begins to loosen. Old certainties start losing their authority. Old explanations stop feeling convincing. The mind becomes restless because the story it has been living inside no longer fully explains its suffering. Most people avoid this stage because it feels unproductive. There are no visible results yet. Only discomfort, self-observation, contradiction, and the uneasy sense that the life you built around your current identity may no longer be able to hold who you are becoming. But this is often the hidden threshold. Transformation does not begin when you know exactly what to do. It begins when you can no longer remain loyal to what has been quietly shrinking you. Psychological perspectives on transformation. Psychology has been circling this mystery for generations, each theorist describing a different side of the same inner event. Carl Jung called it individuation, the painful but necessary movement toward becoming whole. Maslow described it as self-actualization, the gradual realization of what a person is capable of becoming once survival is no longer the only concern. Different language, same gravity. A human being is not meant to remain psychologically unfinished forever. But beneath all terminology lies a simpler truth. Transformation begins when the cost of remaining the same becomes more painful than the fear of changing. That threshold matters because most people do not cross it consciously. They do not choose their lives from a place of freedom. They repeat emotional patterns they learned long before they had language for them. They inherit ways of interpreting love, failure, worth, conflict, ambition, and belonging. Then, years later, they call those inherited patterns personality. What they do not see is that much of what feels natural is actually conditioned. A belief formed in childhood becomes an adult limitation. A family atmosphere becomes an internal rule. A cultural script becomes a ceiling. And over time, these invisible conclusions start governing what a person believes is possible for someone like them. I am not enough. People like me do not succeed. It is too late now. I always ruin things. I should not want too much. Quiet sentences, ordinary sentences, but they do not remain sentences. They become structure. They become architecture. And before long, an entire life begins to rise around them. Awareness is the first act of rebellion. This is why transformation does not begin with force. It begins with seeing, not fixing everything at once, not tearing down every internal wall in one heroic effort, just seeing clearly enough to realize that the wall is there. That moment is more radical than it appears, because awareness is the first act of rebellion against a conditioned mind. The moment you recognize a pattern, your relationship to it changes. You may still feel its pull. You may still obey it sometimes. But something essential has shifted. You are no longer fully fused with it. You are no longer mistaking it for truth. And that matters not only philosophically, but biologically. Research on neuroplasticity suggests that the brain is not a fixed script, but a living system shaped by repetition, attention, and experience. Each time an old thought is interrupted, each time a familiar emotional reaction is witnessed instead of blindly obeyed, something new begins to form, a different pathway, a different probability, a different future response. This is what makes awareness so powerful, not because awareness instantly changes your life, but because awareness interrupts inevitability. The old self survives by remaining invisible. It thrives in automation. It depends on you reacting before you have had time to notice what is happening. Once light enters the pattern loses some of its authority. You may still repeat it, but you will repeat it with consciousness. And consciousness is where change quietly starts to gather strength. The paradox of change. Everyone wants it, but no one wants the discomfort. Here is the paradox few people want to confront. Almost everyone wants the expansion of transformation. Very few want the friction that makes it possible. They want the confidence without the exposure, the peace without the grief, the discipline without the identity loss. They want a new life that does not require the death of familiar patterns, but the psyche does not work that way. Discomfort is not always evidence that something is wrong. Often, it is evidence that something old is being challenged. When the brain is forced beyond what is familiar, it does not interpret that shift as liberation at first. It interprets it as risk. The body tightens, the mind rationalizes, resistance appears, and then disguises itself as fatigue, confusion, postponement, doubt. This is why change can feel strangely threatening, even when it is good for you. The old self does not resist because it is evil. It resists because its job has been stability. Familiar suffering can feel safer to the nervous system than unfamiliar freedom. The ego would often rather remain consistent than become expanded. So when you try to wake earlier, speak more honestly, set a boundary, stop numbing, or begin the work you have delayed for months, what rises up is not always laziness. Sometimes it is identity defense. Sometimes it is your internal system trying to return you to the person it already knows how to be. And this is where many people misunderstand themselves. They think resistance means they are weak. Often resistance means they are standing exactly at the edge where growth becomes real. Real transformation begins with self-concept, not habits. That is why deep transformation does not begin with habits. It begins with self-concept. A person can temporarily borrow better behavior. They can clean the room, wake early, save money, speak confidently, act disciplined. But if the identity underneath remains unchanged, the mind will eventually drag behavior back toward what feels psychologically consistent. Because human beings do not only act from intention, they act from identity coherence. If someone still sees themselves as disorganized, unworthy, incapable, chaotic, late, weak, or broken, then improved behavior will often feel like performance rather than truth, and performance is exhausting. The nervous system cannot sustain what the self-concept does not authorize. This is why subtle language matters. The sentence, "I need to force myself to become disciplined," carries a completely different psychological weight than "I am becoming someone who honors what matters." The first sentence creates war. The second creates alignment. Once identity begins to shift, behavior stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like expression. You are no longer trying to act against yourself. You are acting from a version of yourself that is becoming more believable to your own mind. This is also why reflection practices matter more than people think. Therapy, journaling, Honest self-observation. Long periods of solitude. These are not passive acts. They are methods of making the invisible visible. They bring hidden assumptions into conscious view. And once an unconscious belief is seen clearly, it loses the privilege of running your life unchallenged. Transformation, then, is not just self-improvement. It is self-redefinition. Transformation is not linear. It happens in cycles. But redefinition is rarely linear. People love the fantasy of clean progress because it protects them from ambiguity. They want to believe growth moves in a straight upward direction. Insight, action, improvement, arrival. But anyone who has undergone real change knows it almost never unfolds like that. It comes in waves. You move forward, then doubt yourself. You outgrow something, then grieve it. You see clearly one week and collapse into old patterns the next. There are moments of progress, then retreat, then strange periods where nothing seems to be happening at all. This does not mean the process is broken. It means the process is alive. Joseph Campbell's hero's journey remains compelling for a reason. It reflects something psychologically true. Transformation requires departure, disorientation, confrontation, and return. A person must leave the familiar world of self-definition before they can build a new relationship with who they are. There is always a liminal stage, a threshold identity, a between self, a period in which you are no longer who you were, but not yet stable in who you are becoming. This stage can feel deeply uncomfortable because the old certainties are gone, yet the new self still feels unproven. And still, this is where some of the most important work happens. The brain, too, seems to mirror this cycle. In periods of transition, self-referential networks become more active. The mind revisits memory, reinterprets meaning, revises inner narrative. It begins editing the story through which identity has been held together. And the story matters, because the self is not built only from events, it is built from interpretation. You become what you believe. In a neurological sense, this is why the phrase, "you become what you believe," is more than a motivational slogan. Belief is not a decorative layer added to life. It is an organizing principle. It shapes attention, expectation, physiology, and behavior. What the mind rehearses repeatedly, the nervous system begins to treat as real. A belief is not just an idea you think. It is a pattern your brain has practiced until it feels like reality. When someone believes they are fundamentally inadequate, they do not merely hold that thought in abstraction. They scan for evidence that confirms it. They interpret neutral events through it. Their posture changes under it. Their decisions shrink around it. Their future begins bending to accommodate it. This is what makes belief so powerful, and also so dangerous when left unconscious. The problem is that many people try to change by force while leaving their deepest assumptions untouched. They attempt confident behavior while privately identifying as inferior. They perform courage while still narrating themselves as fragile. They chase change without confronting the story that defines what feels believable. The unconscious mind is not easily persuaded by performance. It knows the old script too well. So, transformation demands something harder than effort. It demands truth. It asks a person to notice the beliefs that have been functioning like internal laws and then create enough lived evidence, emotional repetition, and conscious practice to make a new law more credible than the old one. Not overnight, but over time, with honesty, repetition, and reality-based experience, the nervous system begins to trust a different version of self. And then the impossible starts feeling less impossible. Not because the world changed first, but because the mind stopped worshiping the old limitation as fate. Radical honesty is the foundation of transformation, which leads to something most people spend years avoiding. Radical honesty, not the brutal kind that humiliates the self, not confession as punishment, but a quiet, sober willingness to tell the truth about what is actually happening inside. This is what I feel. This is what I keep avoiding. This is what I pretend does not hurt. This is what I say I want. And this is how I keep betraying it. This is the fear beneath the pattern. This is the grief beneath the numbness. That kind of honesty changes the atmosphere of the inner world, because denial consumes energy. Distortion consumes energy. Maintaining a flattering or defended self-image consumes energy. And much of what people call exhaustion is not only overwork, it is the fatigue of psychological self-deception. Radical honesty disrupts that. At first, it can feel painful because it strips away protective narratives. But there is a difference between pain that damages and pain that reveals. Like cleaning a wound, truth stings because it touches what is not healed. Yet from that point forward, change becomes cleaner. You stop trying to transform from self-rejection and start transforming from self-contact. You stop treating yourself like a project to be fixed and start relating to yourself as a fragmented whole asking to be understood. This distinction is everything. Much of modern self-help is built on contempt disguised as ambition. It assumes the current self is a problem to be corrected. But deep psychological transformation is not built on contempt. It is built on integration. The rejected parts do not disappear because you shame them. They soften when they are seen, understood, and placed back into relationship with the rest of you. Procrastination is not just a lack of discipline. It is often hidden fear. Take procrastination. On the surface, it looks like poor discipline, delay, disorganization, avoidance, an inability to do what matters when it needs to be done. But underneath, procrastination often functions as emotional protection. A person delays not always because they do not care, but because the task has become fused with something threatening. Failure, exposure, judgment, disappointment, sometimes even success, because success can demand a larger identity than the current self feels safe inhabiting. So the mind postpones, not because it is stupid, because it is trying to protect the person from an experience it has unconsciously coded as dangerous. This is why shame rarely solves procrastination. Shame adds another layer of threat, which only increases the need for avoidance. The task becomes heavier, the self-concept worsens, and the cycle reinforces itself. But when the fear beneath the delay is met with curiosity, the pattern begins to loosen. Not instantly, but meaningfully, because the nervous system no longer has to protect itself through the same degree of resistance. The behavior starts making sense. And once behavior makes sense, it becomes more workable. This is true far beyond procrastination. Many of the habits people hate in themselves are not random defects. They are outdated strategies. Anxiety can be preparation. Perfectionism can be armor. Emotional withdrawal can be old protection. Numbing can be an attempt at regulation. Transformation becomes possible when a person stops asking, "Why am I like this?" with disgust, and starts asking, "What is this pattern trying to protect me from?" with honesty. That question changes everything. Mindfulness and self-compassion increase the capacity for change. This is why mindfulness and self-compassion matter so much in the psychology of change. Not because they sound gentle, not because they are trendy, but because they alter the conditions under which transformation becomes neurologically possible. When discomfort is approached with judgment, the brain often amplifies threat. The body tightens. Defensiveness increases. The person becomes less capable of flexible thinking. Fear takes over the system, and long-term change becomes harder to access. But when inner discomfort is approached with observation and compassion, the system begins to settle. Threat reduces. Attention widens. The prefrontal regions involved in reflection, choice, and regulation become more available. In simpler terms, self-kindness is not indulgence. It is strategy. A person who can pause before reacting, breathe before collapsing into old behavior, notice an impulse without immediately becoming it, is not doing something small. They are building a different relationship with their own mind, and most transformation happens exactly there. Not in grand declarations, not in dramatic reinventions, but in quiet, nearly invisible moments when a person chooses differently in real time. A softer response, a boundary once avoided, a truth finally spoken, a familiar spiral interrupted by 1 second of awareness. These moments rarely look cinematic, but they are psychologically revolutionary. Because identity is not changed only by what you understand. It is changed by what you repeatedly practice under pressure. And every time you meet your own inner world with steadiness instead of hostility, you make growth more biologically possible. You only realize you've changed when you look back. One of the strangest things about transformation is that it often remains invisible while it is happening. There is rarely a trumpet sound, rarely a clean moment where you can declare with certainty that the old self has ended and the new one has fully arrived. Most of the time, the process is too gradual to recognize from the inside. You only see it in retrospect. You notice that certain conversations no longer pull you into the same emotional trap. You notice that an old insecurity no longer dominates the room. You notice that something that once would have shattered you now passes through without taking your identity with it. And then, quietly, the realization comes. You have changed. Not because you became flawless, not because pain disappeared, but because the things that used to define you no longer hold the same authority. Your past self might not fully recognize the way you now think, respond, choose, or endure. And that can feel both beautiful and unsettling. Because transformation is not only about gaining something, it is also about becoming unfamiliar to your former self. But even then, the process does not end. There is always another threshold, another layer, another illusion waiting to dissolve. Growth is not a single awakening. It is a repeated invitation to become more honest, more integrated, more capable of inhabiting reality without hiding from it. Perfection is not required. Participation is. The mind will still resist. The heart will still hesitate. Old fears will still try to narrate the future. But something deeper begins to strengthen. A quiet willingness to keep moving toward truth, even when certainty is unavailable. And perhaps that is one of the clearest signs of transformation. Not that fear disappears, but that fear is no longer the only voice in the room. Transformation is not about discipline or motivation. It is about awareness. What most people misunderstand about transformation is that they treat it as a battle of willpower, as if the central question is whether you are disciplined enough, motivated enough, productive enough, strong enough to overpower the weaker parts of yourself. But the deeper question is different. Can you see clearly enough? Because awareness changes the entire structure of the struggle. Once you truly see the machinery of your own mind, the defenses, the stories, the rehearsed fears, the emotional bargains, the identity investments, something shifts. The illusion begins to weaken. The pattern may still be present, but it no longer feels sacred. You stop assuming that every internal voice deserves obedience. That is where freedom starts. Not the freedom of ease, the freedom of conscious choice. Cognitive dissonance explains part of this. When behavior and belief clash, the mind feels pressure. Most people resolve that pressure by returning behavior to match the old belief. They retreat to psychological familiarity. They say, in effect, this new action does not feel like me, so I must go back. But real transformation asks for the opposite. It asks you to remain inside that dissonance long enough for the belief itself to evolve. That middle stage is profoundly uncomfortable. You are too awake to fully return to the old identity, but not yet stable enough to trust the new one. The ground feels psychologically unstable. And yet, this is exactly where identity begins hardening around a higher truth. This is why every day matters. Transformation is not one grand event. It is 1,000 subtle negotiations between who you were and who you are rehearsing. Some days you will respond from wisdom. Some days you will collapse back into habit. But collapse is not erasure. Once awareness enters the system, it leaves a trace. You can ignore truth for a while, but you cannot completely unknow it. Environment is the amplifier of identity. Another truth people tend to underestimate is the role of environment. We like stories in which the heroic individual transcends everything through pure inner strength. But psychologically, the self is porous. It is constantly shaped by context, repetition, suggestion, and surrounding norms. The people around you, the content you consume, the spaces you inhabit, the rhythms you repeat, they are not neutral. They are participating in the construction of identity. Environment is not merely background, it is reinforcement. If you are trying to become more honest, while living among people who reward performance over truth, your nervous system receives conflict. If you are trying to create while surrounded by cynicism, your mind learns to associate expression with ridicule. If you are trying to heal while remaining immersed in the same stimuli that trained the wound, change becomes harder, not because you are weak, but because the environment keeps tutoring the old self. Behavioral psychology has long emphasized the importance of cues and context, and for good reason. A new identity needs evidence around it. It needs signals. It needs friction removed from the direction of growth and added to the habits that belong to the old pattern. This can mean physical changes, relational changes, digital changes, conversational changes. It can mean protecting your attention more seriously. It can mean choosing rooms where your future self is more believable, because every repeated input teaches the nervous system what world it is living in. And from that, the nervous system decides what kind of self is necessary. You cannot repeatedly plant new intentions into old soil and expect them to grow untouched. At some point, transformation requires redesigning the field, not just blaming the seed. Belief is not just thought. It is a biological instruction to the body. Yet even environment is not the deepest layer. Beneath what surrounds you is what you permit yourself to believe. And belief does not stop at thought. Belief becomes instruction. When a person deeply believes they cannot change, the body often organizes itself around that expectation before action even begins. The breath shortens, attention narrows, energy contracts. Possibility feels emotionally unreal. The body prepares not for effort, but for anticipated disappointment. And when a person begins to believe, truly believe, that change is possible, physiology can shift with it. Focus sharpens. Posture alters. Endurance increases. Perception widens. This is not mysticism. It is the biology of expectation shaping the body's readiness to act. The brain responds powerfully to what it regards as likely, familiar, and meaningful. This is part of why visualization, when emotionally convincing and tied to real behavior, can affect performance. The brain often recruits similar networks when vividly imagining an action and when enacting it. Repeated internal rehearsal reduces unfamiliarity, and what feels less unfamiliar tends to evoke less resistance. But this is not about fantasizing. It is about training recognizability. The nervous system does not need the future self to feel grand. It needs the future self to feel possible. The more vividly, consistently, and honestly you practice that possibility, the more your system begins reorganizing around it, thought by thought, choice by choice, sensation by sensation. In that sense, transformation is not only about what you do, it is about what your entire system is learning to expect from you. Transformation is not pretending. It is embodiment. Still, transformation is not pretending. Pretending says, I will perform an identity that does not belong to me. Embodiment says, I will begin living in alignment with something true that fear has been obscuring. That distinction matters, because many people are exhausted not by growth itself, but by imitation. They try to adopt confidence as theater, discipline as costume, healing as image, but the psyche knows when something is cosmetic. What is merely performed rarely reaches the deeper layers where change becomes stable. Embodiment is different. It does not require denial of where you are. It asks for a gradual inhabiting of what is already trying to emerge beneath the noise. At the deepest level, many human beings are not trying to become someone entirely new. They are trying to recover contact with who they are when fear, adaptation, and survival strategies are no longer running the whole system. This is the paradox. Transformation can feel like becoming another person, while in a deeper sense, it is often a return, a remembering, a removal of distortions, the reclaiming of something essential that had to go underground in order to survive. Philosophers and psychoanalysts have long explored variations of the false self, the persona constructed to receive love, avoid danger, remain acceptable, and preserve belonging. As children, we adapt brilliantly. We learn what earns approval, what attracts rejection, what emotions are safe, what desires are dangerous, what version of us will be easier for the world to tolerate. But adaptation has a cost. Eventually, the mask that once protected you begins to suffocate you, and transformation begins the moment you become willing to ask a terrifying question. Who am I beneath the person I learned to be? That question alone can start loosening decades of conditioning. Authenticity is not fixed. Identity is always evolving. But even authenticity is not fixed. Many people secretly imagine that if they can just uncover their true self, the search will end. They will arrive at some final identity that remains stable forever. Yet psychological life does not work like that. The self is not a statue waiting to be discovered intact. It is a living pattern shaped by experience, meaning, memory, and evolving consciousness. Who you are today is not who you were 5 years ago. And that is not betrayal. It is evidence of life. Transformation asks you to stop chasing a final version of yourself and instead learn how to live in honest relationship with your current truth, knowing that this truth will continue to deepen, complicate, and change. There is humility in that. And courage, too. Not dramatic courage. Quiet courage. The kind required to disappoint older versions of yourself. The kind required to let go of identities that once protected you. The kind required to withstand misunderstanding from people who only know your history, not your becoming. Growth often looks like loss before it looks like freedom. You may lose comfort, familiarity, approval, shared language with certain people, even your own certainty. There may be periods where the new path feels less like empowerment and more like disorientation. That does not mean you are on the wrong road. It may mean you are finally leaving a road that was too small for you. And what you lose in comfort, you often regain in coherence, a quieter mind, a cleaner conscience, a life that begins to feel less split against itself. Suppressed emotions do not disappear. They become patterns. There is another psychological law people rarely respect until they are forced to. What is not felt does not vanish. It changes form. Suppressed emotion becomes tension, overreaction, numbness, projection, chronic fatigue, self-sabotage, unexplained sadness, compulsive distraction, bodily unrest. The psyche does not simply delete unresolved experience. It stores it, translates it, reroutes it. That is why transformation can feel so messy. The moment a person stops running, old emotional material begins rising. Grief long postponed, anger long swallowed, fear long disguised as productivity, emptiness long hidden beneath stimulation. And because these emotions were delayed for so long, their arrival can feel disproportionate. People assume they are getting worse. In reality, they may simply be becoming available to themselves for the first time. This is not collapse. It is release. Tears, confusion, exhaustion, disorientation. These are not always signs of weakness. Sometimes they are evidence that the system is finally processing what it once had to freeze in place. Each release makes more room. And with room comes a subtle shift in one's relationship to time. The future stops feeling like a distant identity you must chase through force. It begins to feel like something emerging naturally from repeated present choices. You stop straining to become and start allowing yourself to live more congruently. This is why, paradoxically, change often accelerates when desperation softens. The moment you stop chasing transformation as a performance can be the moment you begin embodying it as reality. Some transformations look like stillness from the outside. One of the most misunderstood aspects of transformation is that, from the outside, it can look like nothing is happening. There may be no visible progress, no public milestone, no dramatic announcement. A person may spend months in silence, reading, reflecting, writing, feeling. withdrawing from noise, re-evaluating how they relate to everything. To others, it can appear like stagnation. Inside, it may be reorganization, because not all progress is behavioral at first. Some of it is perceptual, some of it is emotional, some of it is the slow rewiring of meaning. Old assumptions are being questioned, automatic reactions are being interrupted, unconscious loyalties are being exposed. These changes are difficult to display, but they are not minor. In fact, some of the deepest revolutions happen quietly in the background of ordinary life, far from applause, far from measurable results, far from the part of culture that only knows how to respect visible motion. And then one day, the new self stabilizes enough to be felt. Not as excitement, as familiarity. You do not feel like you became someone artificial. You feel, strangely, like you have come home. The inner conflict is not gone, but it is quieter. Triggers lose some of their command. You respond with more space between impulse and action. You speak with less rehearsal. You need less external proof to remain internally steady. This is psychological maturity, not the absence of pain, but the presence of perspective. When emotional centers and reflective capacities begin working more coherently together, reaction becomes less compulsory. Choice becomes more available. You stop being dragged around by every internal weather pattern. You begin relating to yourself with regulation instead of chaos. And even here, the process does not end. The self is not a destination. It is an ongoing calibration, the meaning of suffering and the threshold of transformation. Viktor Frankl wrote that when we can no longer change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. That sentence carries the full weight of transformation, because sooner or later, every person reaches a threshold where external control is no longer enough. Circumstances refuse to obey. Loss arrives. Plans collapse. Identities break open. And at that threshold, a more difficult question appears. If I cannot control what is happening, what meaning will I create in response to it? This is where suffering can begin to change shape. Not because pain becomes pleasant, not because hardship becomes romantic, but because meaning prevents suffering from becoming spiritually empty. The inner life regains agency when experience is interpreted, integrated, and used as material for a deeper becoming. So if you find yourself in uncertainty now, in that strange region where the old structure is dissolving and the new one has not yet fully formed, it does not necessarily mean you are failing. It may mean you are in the threshold itself. Ambiguity is not always a sign of being lost. Sometimes it is the space between identities. Sometimes it is what transformation feels like before language catches up.